Hi again, everybody. It's your old pal, the History Nerd. I am back in the man cave, but as you have no doubt noticed, I am not on the couch. Instead, I have moved here to the bar area of the man cave. So let me take a moment to explain why. In my previous YouTube videos in which I unboxed cowboy hats and cowboy boots on the couch, a few of you eagle-eyed viewers have spotted, nestled in the corner of the built-in cabinets behind me, a few bottles of bourbon. And you have suggested that I do a bourbon tasting video. Well, it is true. I am an avid collector of that magical brown water elixir known as Kentucky bourbon. And the History Nerd here is, if anything, a people pleaser. So in this video, we are going to open, taste, sample, and review a brand new, unopened, just added to my collection bottle of E.H. Taylor Single Barrel Bourbon. But first, as you've probably come to expect, from a guy who calls himself the History Nerd, I want to share with you the history of the man for whom E.H. Taylor Jr. Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey is named. So let's get started. This fella right here, Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr., was born in Kentucky in 1830. To parents who, at least at one point in their lives, made their living as slave traders. By the time he was 9 years old, young Edmund lost his father, who died from typhus while traveling from New Orleans back to Kentucky. Typhus was a bacterial infection that is spread through the bites of infected mites, fleas, and lice. So after losing his father, Edmund was sent to live with his great uncle, General Zachary Taylor, who 20 years later would be elected president of these United States. As a matter of fact, E.H. Taylor was closely related to three presidents: Zachary Taylor, James Madison, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was also from Kentucky. E.H. Taylor didn't stay long with his great uncle Zachary Taylor. He eventually was raised by the uncle for whom he was named. And at that point, he added a junior to the end of his name. And forevermore throughout adulthood, he referred to himself as Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. Now you're probably thinking, if he was a colonel, he must have served in the military. And if that's what you were thinking, you are incorrect. You see, in 1813, the governor of Kentucky, for poops and giggles, decided to name one of his buddies an aide-de-camp to the governor and gave him the purely honorary title of colonel. And that began a tradition. Ever since, Kentucky governors have had the power to name supporters, prominent citizens, and basically whoever they want a Kentucky colonel. So E.H. Taylor, Colonel E.H. Taylor, was not a military colonel. He was a Kentucky colonel. But there are other famous Kentucky colonels. Harlan Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, was not a military colonel. He was a Kentucky colonel. Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis Presley's manager, again, not a military colonel, a Kentucky colonel. And truth be known, 25 years ago, Governor Paul Patton of Kentucky bestowed upon the old history nerd here the title of Kentucky Colonel. So henceforth, you may refer to me as Colonel Nerd. E.H. Taylor is a towering figure in bourbon history. But to my knowledge, the guy never made a single drop of bourbon himself. Instead, he was known for financing, building, and operating some of the most famous bourbon distilleries in history. One of his distilleries, the Old Fire Copper Distillery, is known today as Buffalo Trace Distillery, perhaps the most popular distillery operating in 2023. He also constructed and ran the Old Taylor Distillery. This is a decanter depicting the Old Taylor Distillery. You may recognize it. It's known today as the Castle and Key Distillery. E.H. Taylor also was one of the early embracers of new technology for making bourbon. He's a guy who converted his distillery to copper fermentation tanks, one of the first. He was one of the first to embrace column stills in his distilleries. He was one of the first to put steam heat in the aging warehouses where bourbon is aged so he could regulate the kind of temperature and weather that the bourbon underwent. But his biggest contribution to bourbon history was none of those things. Instead, in the 19th century, the bourbon was sold by the barrel, and folks called rectifiers would buy barrels of bourbon, and they would bottle the bourbon, affix the label to it, and then they would sell it to the public. They were the middleman who sold the bourbon. Well, some rectifiers were not honest folks, and they would buy a barrel of good quality bourbon from the Old Taylor Distillery, and when they bottled it, they would cut the bourbon with prune juice. Tea was used sometimes, neutral spirits. Sometimes they even put tobacco juice into the bourbon bottle after they cut it with neutral spirits, and it was too lightly colored. They would put tobacco juice in it to darken the color. So folks would go to the rectifier and buy what they thought was a bottle of good quality Old Taylor bourbon, and when they opened it and drank it, it was swill. So you can imagine the operators of the bourbon distilleries were angered by that, and they said, we've got to fix it. Well, E.H. Taylor had served 4 terms as mayor of Frankfort, Kentucky, and he also served in the Kentucky Senate. So he said, let's find a political solution to our bourbon problem. So in 1897, E.H. Taylor went to the U.S. Congress and convinced them to pass what was known as the Bottle and Bond Act. That was the first consumer protection law ever passed in the United States. And that law said if a distillery met certain rules and guidelines laid out by the federal government, they could put bottled in bond, a federal government seal of approval on their bourbon. So when it went to the consumer would know that they weren't getting swill that some rectifier had messed with. They were getting good quality bourbon. So in order to be considered bottle and bond, a bourbon has to be made by one distiller in one distilling season. The bourbon has to be aged at least 4 years in a federal government warehouse, a bonded warehouse that it's supervised by the federal government, and it has to be 100 proof. Not 101, not 98, not 99, 100 proof to be bottled in bond. That revolutionized the bourbon industry of the 19th century and early 20th century. It saved the bourbon industry, and even to this day, many distilleries sell their bourbon with bottled in bond on it, so folks will know it's good quality bourbon aged at least 4 years. That's 100 proof. So E.H. Taylor passed the Bottled in Bond Act. He owned the Old Fire Copper Distillery, which is Buffalo Trace today, but he ran into some financial problems. Matter of fact, E.H. Taylor went bankrupt. And another famous name in bourbon, George T. Stagg, ended up buying the distillery for pennies on the dollar from E.H. Taylor to help him through his financial woes. But there was a problem. E.H. Taylor made Old Taylor bourbon at the Old Fire Copper Distillery, which George Stagg changed the name to the George T. Stagg Distillery. I have a postcard here that shows the George T. Stagg Distillery that used to be Old Fire Copper. By the way, if you collect bourbon like I do and display it, you can find vintage postcards of old distilleries and old decanters like this Old Taylor Distillery decanter, and they make great items to mix among your bottles on the shelf, and it just makes a very attractive display. So anyway, George Stagg bought the Old Fire Copper Distillery for pennies on the dollar to help E.H. Taylor get out of bankruptcy, but he continued to make Old Taylor bourbon with E.H. Taylor's name and signature on it, even though E.H. Taylor no longer had anything to do with the distillery. So E.H. Taylor filed a lawsuit, and it took 13 years for that lawsuit to work its way through the courts. But ultimately, the courts ruled that E.H. Taylor could keep his name and likeness and did not have to surrender that to George Stagg. So E.H. Taylor made Old Taylor bourbon at the Old Taylor Distillery, which is now Castle and Key. When Prohibition came into play, like all other bourbon manufacturers, E.H. Taylor was forced to retire, and he lived happily in retirement until 1923, when he died at the age of 92 years old. The cause of his death was the fact that he was 92 cotton picking years old. Now, Old Taylor bourbon kept being manufactured after his death, and it's still made today. About 40 years ago, Old Taylor came out with an ad campaign that said, look, we recognize that E.H. Taylor was a jerk. He treated his employees terribly. He demanded perfection, and he worked his employees like dogs. But because of that, E.H. Taylor, or Old Taylor bourbon, is a good quality bourbon today. Not a very flattering ad campaign, but it's one that they ran. So that brings us to 2013, when Sazerac, who owns Buffalo Trace Distillery today, said, let's honor E.H. Taylor with a bourbon line that's better than Old Taylor, which is kind of a bottom shelf bourbon, to be honest with you. It's sold in plastic bottles in a lot of places, so it's not a great bourbon. So in 2013, Buffalo Trace came out with E.H. Taylor bourbon, and it has several different varietals in the line, some of which I have here. These are all highly allocated and hard to find, especially at retail price. But the one you can find most easily is the E.H. Taylor small batch. They also make E.H. Taylor straight rye, E.H. Taylor barrel proof, and the one that we're going to try today, which is the E.H. Taylor single barrel. Small batch is the only one you can find pretty easily, and even then it's probably going to be marked up. The other three, pretty hard to get, but not the hardest to get. There are other E.H. Taylor bourbons that, let me put it this way. Bigfoot is spotted in the wild more often than some varieties of E.H. Taylor bourbon. Those include the Tornado Survivor Warehouse C, the Amaranth Grain of the Gods, the 4-grain, the 18-year marriage, and there's a couple more, folks. But look, I'm never going to see them in my lifetime, and you probably will never have a chance to see one in person in your lifetime because they are that rare. Now, a few years ago, in honor of the 125th anniversary of the passage of the Bottled in Bond Act and E.H. Taylor's role in it, Sierra Nevada Brewing Company partnered with Buffalo Trace to produce E.H. Taylor Ale, which is aged for 7 years. It's a barley wine ale. I'm not a beer guy. I don't know what I'm talking about. But anyway, it's a hard to get, really expensive, really nice kind of beer that's aged for 7 years in E.H. Taylor barrels. And it sells for $25 a bottle. And I believe it's 15% alcohol by volume, which is getting up there for beer as I understand it. And that brings us to our tasting portion of the presentation. I know many of you are clapping, saying thank goodness, but at least you're more educated about E.H. Taylor than you were when this video started. So here's my bottle of E.H. Taylor Single Barrel. This retails for $60 a bottle. I paid $60 for this bottle. I have never paid secondary prices, inflated prices for any bottle in my collection. By the way, every bottle in my collection has been opened except I got a couple of bottles of Pappy Van Winkle that I'm saving for my daughter's either graduation or from college or her marriage. But I paid $60 for this bottle. I pay retail for all my bottles. Your next question is probably, oh, history nerd, how do you get away with paying only retail for your hard-to-get bourbons? And my response to you is, it ain't none of your damn business. I ain't sharing my secrets with you. But on the secondary market right now, the E.H. Taylor, Colonel E.H. Taylor Single Barrel Bourbon runs about $150 to $200 on the secondary market. You see the seal here? It is unbroken. Right now, this bottle is worth $200, basically. When I break this seal, it ain't gonna be worth anything to anybody but me. So let's twist the cap. Nice little pop there. Pour it into our Glencairn. For those of you who are relatively new to bourbon, this is a Glencairn glass. This is a tasting glass. It's designed for tasting bourbon and other whiskeys. It's got a big bottom and a skinny top. Much like the girl I dated back in college, it's got a small bottom and a skinny top. But the reason for that is it allows the aromas to kind of funnel up into your nose, which we will talk about in a moment. All right, there's our single barrel poured into the Glencairn. I am very anal about making sure that the little fake tax stamp on my bottles line up. So there, that's lined up, pretty much. Anyway, look, I used to think, you know, have you ever seen a wine snob who would sniff wine and say, oh, I get the aroma of lilies in springtime dew, ripe pomegranate, and a little bit of coriander in the background. And you would sit there and think, what a pretentious prick. I thought that too. But then when I got into bourbon, I learned two very important things. The first is, if you sniff and concentrate, you really can pick up aromas in a bourbon if you concentrate. And the second thing is, and this is very, very important, 80 to 90% of your sense of taste, according to science, is based upon smell. That's why if you ever have a head cold and you're so congested and you eat and your food is bland and you can't taste your food, that's because your sense of smell is compromised. A lot of folks who had COVID said they lost their sense of taste. Well, that's because they were very congested and lost their sense of smell, and with that goes their sense of taste. But eventually, it comes back. So always nose your bourbon, because that helps the next step of tasting your bourbon. So we're going to nose. Oh, y'all, I'm telling you, if Glade made a plug-in that smelled like the nose on this bourbon, my whole house would smell like E.H. Taylor bourbon. It's just, it's incredible. You've got some Heath Bar toffee, kind of chocolate toffee in there. By the way, when you're nosing bourbon, this is again for the beginners, you don't just stick your nose in there and take a big whiff with your mouth closed. You know why? Because you're going to get a big blast of ethanol, and that's all you're going to smell. And the scents that you're looking for are underneath the ethanol. So what you do when you nose a bourbon, when you inhale, you keep your mouth open a little bit. And that way the ethanol passes through your nose and out your mouth, and you can smell the underlying scents. Again, I know I sound like a pretentious prick, but hey, they proved it right. So, you know, I'm buying into it. All right, you got the Heath Bar, the toffee. You got buttered corn. I mean, it smells, it's corn, but it's the corn that you put in a pot on the stove. You just take a big slab of butter and put it in there. Oh, it's good. It's got maple syrup is in here. Not a lot of oak. I'm not getting a lot of oak, but I'm getting citrus. I'm getting a good bit of citrus. So there you go. You got Heath Bar, you got buttered corn, you got citrus, you got maple syrup. So after you nose it, you swirl it around a little bit, then you take a sip. Oh, that's good, y'all. Oh, that's good. Citrus. You got a lot of citrus. You got the cinnamon red hot candies. You know, they come in a little box when you were a kid. If you're my age, the little cinnamon red hot candies. And you just pop them in your mouth, and it'd make your mouth catch on fire for a while. But it's got that cinnamon. It's got citrus and cinnamon. It's got that maple, and y'all, the mouthfeel on this is oily. I mean, it's got a very thick viscosity. I mean, it just dances down the back of your throat. And the finish, oh man, that's good. You got the buttered corn, you got citrus, you got the cinnamon, and on the finish, which is that last lingering bit, I've got a good hug in my chest. It's got that warmth in my chest, and at the very end, you get some oak. You get that nice woody flavor that most bourbon has, and this has the syrup in it too. But that might be that oily viscosity is making me think syrup. But man, this is good. Yeah, and look at the legs. You probably can't see it. But this bourbon is just dripping ever so slowly down the inside of this glass. I mean, it is as oily a bourbon as you're going to find anywhere. Y'all, I am ecstatic. If I weren't on camera, I would do dirty things to this bourbon. That's how good it is. But I'm going to be honest with you. E.H. Taylor small batch, I dabbled in bourbon. But when I tried E.H. Taylor small batch for the first time, that's what made me jump into bourbon with both feet. This was my high school girlfriend. This bourbon got me excited and led to all of the other bourbons in my collection. I've probably got at least a couple of hundred bottles. So I'm going to give this 5 thumbs up out of 5, folks. I mean, but I'm going to be honest with you. The barrel proof, if you ever get a chance to try the barrel proof, this is by far, of all the E.H. Taylors I've had, the barrel proof is the absolute best. You can't go wrong with any of them. I'm not really a rye guy, but the barrel proof is great. Single barrel, I'm enjoying it. And y'all, this is the first time I've ever had this bourbon. It is wonderful. Small batch, like I said, it's my high school girlfriend. The rye is okay, but I'm not really a rye guy. So anyway, look, if you can ever find E.H. Taylor, whether at retail, any of the varieties, whether at retail or slightly above retail, don't go crazy. Don't pay $150, $200 a bottle for this. If you hunt, you can maybe find it for less than that. But if you can find any E.H. Taylor at retail, you need to buy it all day and twice on Sunday if your area allows liquor sales on Sunday. So, oh, that's so good. I'm going to take one more sip and swallow. And I'm going to say, look, folks, if you enjoyed this video and the other videos that are on my channel and want to see more like them, I need you to do 3 things for me. Give me the Fonzie thumbs up, hit subscribe, and then ring the bell. So the next time I fire up the old YouTube gizmo, you will be the first to know. I'm going to close this bourbon tasting video like I close all of my videos by asking all of you to be good, be well, be happy, and goodbye, my friends. I will see you soon.